Sometimes the most dangerous mistake a person can make is assuming an old woman is powerless. The fluorescent lights above the grocery store buzzed softly as shoppers pushed carts through narrow aisles packed with canned soup, frozen dinners, and discounted cereal boxes. But near Register 6, everything had stopped. A tall white police officer stood over a frail-looking elderly black woman whose gray coat brushed against the polished floor tiles while nervous whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. "You thief!" Officer Daniel Brooks shouted loud enough for the entire store to hear. His voice cut through the air with the sharpness of a siren. "I saw you trying to leave without paying." Phones immediately came out. People stared. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply watched in silence, the way people do when they think someone else will step in first. The woman slowly turned toward him, her silver curls glowing beneath the harsh supermarket lights. She looked to be nearly 70, her posture calm despite the humiliation unfolding around her. In one hand, she held a small carton of milk and a loaf of wheat bread. In the other was an old leather purse worn thin from decades of use. "Officer," she said quietly, "there's been a misunderstanding." But Brooks barely let her finish. "Save it," he snapped. "I've heard every excuse in the book." His hand motioned toward the automatic doors where a nervous cashier stood trembling beside the register. "Store security said you were acting suspicious near the self-checkout." The woman glanced toward the young cashier, whose guilty expression revealed uncertainty more than accusation. But Officer Brooks had already decided what he believed. And once a man like him decided something, the truth rarely mattered afterward. The old woman nodded slowly, almost sadly, as if she had seen this exact moment before. "May I at least explain?" she asked. Brooks scoffed loudly. Funny how people always want to explain after they get caught. A few shoppers shifted awkwardly. One mother quietly pulled her daughter closer. An older man lowered his eyes and pretended to study a shelf of canned beans. The tension inside the store thickened with every passing second. Then Brooks stepped forward and grabbed the woman's purse from her hands. The contents spilled across the floor in front of everyone. A prescription bottle rolled beneath a candy rack. A pair of reading glasses skidded across the tile. A faded photograph of a smiling younger man in military uniform fluttered down beside her shoes. The woman never raised her voice, never argued, never panicked. That was the part that felt strange. Her eyes remained steady, calm in a way that didn't fit the situation. It wasn't fear in those eyes. It was patience. Cold, measured patience. A little boy standing beside his mother pointed toward a small silver object that had fallen from the purse. "Mom," he whispered softly, "what's that badge?" The crowd leaned closer. Resting near the woman's feet was an old silver FBI credential holder, scratched with age but unmistakable under the bright white lights. For the first time, several people in the store stopped looking at the old woman and started looking at Officer Brooks instead. The supermarket had gone completely silent. Even the squeaking shopping carts and humming freezer units seemed distant now as every pair of eyes locked onto the silver FBI credential lying on the floor beside Margaret Hayes. Officer Daniel Brooks stared at it for half a second before letting out a short laugh under his breath. "Nice prop," he muttered, kicking the badge holder lightly with the edge of his boot. "You think carrying around fake federal junk is going to scare me?" A nervous ripple moved through the crowd. The little boy who had spotted the badge tightened his grip on his mother's hand, while an elderly cashier near Register 6 quietly removed her glasses and looked closer. Margaret slowly bent down, her movements calm and controlled despite the dozens of phones pointed at her face. She picked up the credential holder carefully and brushed dust from its surface with the sleeve of her gray coat. Her hands did not shake. That was what unsettled people the most. Most innocent people became emotional when accused in public. Most people cried, argued, or begged to be believed. Margaret Hayes simply stood there, with the quiet composure of someone who had survived far worse than embarrassment inside a grocery store. "Officer," she said softly, "I am asking you one last time to slow down and listen." Brooks folded his arms across his chest. "And I am telling you that store security watched you skip the scanner at self-checkout." Margaret glanced toward the frightened cashier again. "No," she replied gently. "The machine froze while I was paying." The cashier swallowed hard. "Actually, I think there may have been an issue with Register 4 earlier," she admitted quietly. Brooks shot her a cold look sharp enough to silence her instantly. Stay out of this, he snapped. The cashier lowered her eyes immediately. Margaret noticed it. So did everyone else. The atmosphere inside the store began to change in subtle ways that Brooks either ignored or refused to see. People were no longer staring at Margaret with suspicion. They were beginning to study the officer instead. An older man near the frozen food aisle slowly shook his head. A woman recording on her phone whispered, "Something feels wrong about this." But Brooks doubled down harder, the way insecure men often do once doubt enters the room. "You people always have excuses ready," he said loudly. The words landed heavily in the air. Several shoppers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret looked directly at him for the first time since the confrontation began. Her dark brown eyes were calm, intelligent, and strangely unreadable. "You people," she repeated quietly. Brooks immediately realized others had heard it too, but pride would not let him back away now. "Do not twist my words," he replied sharply. Margaret studied him for a long moment, and somehow her silence felt heavier than shouting ever could. Then she slowly opened the old leather purse again and removed a folded photograph. The edges were worn soft with age. She held it gently between her fingers before handing it toward him. "That man," she said, "was my husband." Brooks hesitated before taking the photo. Inside it was a younger Margaret standing beside a tall man in military dress uniform outside a government building in Washington. Both were smiling proudly at the camera. On the back of the photograph, faded blue ink read, "To Maggie, 30 years protecting a country that never fully learned how to protect you back." Brooks frowned slightly. "What is this supposed to mean?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "It means," she said, "that some lessons arrive too late for the people who need them most." Before Brooks could respond, the sharp sound of tires stopping outside echoed through the front windows of the supermarket. Then came another vehicle. And another. Several black SUVs rolled silently into the parking lot, while every customer near the entrance turned to look. Margaret did not even glance toward the doors. It was almost as if she had been expecting them all along. The moment the black SUVs stopped outside the supermarket, the energy inside the building shifted completely. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones slowly lowered. Even Officer Daniel Brooks seemed unsure for the first time that evening, though he quickly tried to hide it behind the same hard expression he had worn since the confrontation began. Through the front glass windows, men in dark suits stepped out one by one with calm, purposeful movements. They were not rushing. That was the unsettling part. People who panicked moved fast. People in control never needed to. Margaret Hayes stood quietly near the self-checkout lane, holding her old leather purse close against her coat while fluorescent lights reflected softly against the silver strands in her hair. She looked tired now, but not defeated. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical hiss as the first suited man entered the store. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and somewhere in his late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone accustomed to command. His sharp eyes scanned the room once before landing directly on Margaret. The change in his expression happened instantly. Concern. Respect. Then something else beneath both of those emotions. Anger. Not loud anger. Controlled anger. The dangerous kind. "Ma'am," he said firmly as he walked toward her. "Are you all right?" Margaret gave a small nod. "I am fine, Robert." Several people exchanged confused looks. "Officer." Brooks stepped forward immediately, forcing authority back into his voice. "Sir, this woman is currently under investigation for shoplifting." The man slowly turned toward Brooks. For a brief second, silence swallowed the entire store. "Investigation," he repeated calmly. Brooks straightened his shoulders. "That is correct." The man studied him carefully, almost like he was memorizing his face. Then his eyes drifted downward toward the silver handcuffs still hanging from Brooks's belt. "Did you detain her?" he asked. "I followed procedure," Brooks answered quickly. The suited man inhaled slowly through his nose as though choosing his next words very carefully. Behind him, 2 more federal agents entered the supermarket and stopped near the doors. Customers began whispering again. Some were recording openly now. Margaret finally looked toward Brooks again, and somehow her calmness made everything feel worse. "Officer," she said softly, "this is Special Agent Robert Sinclair." Brooks frowned slightly. The name clearly meant nothing to him. But several older shoppers nearby reacted immediately. Sinclair was not just another federal agent. Anyone familiar with law enforcement in the region knew the name. Robert Sinclair had overseen organized crime investigations across 3 states for nearly a decade. And right now, he looked at Margaret Hayes with the kind of respect most people reserved for war heroes. Sinclair reached carefully into his jacket pocket and removed a leather credential wallet before opening it briefly toward Brooks. Federal Bureau of Investigation, he said. Assistant Director. The words hit the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Brooks blinked hard. His confidence flickered for the first time all night. Look, he began. Nobody told me she was federal. Margaret gave a faint, almost sad smile. You never asked, she replied. The cashier near Register 6 covered her mouth with trembling fingers. An elderly veteran standing beside the frozen foods quietly removed his baseball cap out of respect. Brooks looked around and finally realized the crowd was no longer on his side. Not even close. Sinclair stepped beside Margaret carefully. Agent Hayes retired 8 years ago after 32 years of service, he said. Counterintelligence Division. Multiple commendations. Highest field survival record in her unit. Several people stared at Margaret in disbelief. The quiet old woman standing near the self-checkout suddenly felt much larger than the room itself. Brooks swallowed visibly. I did not know, he muttered. Margaret looked directly into his eyes again, calm as ever. That, she said quietly, was never the problem. Officer Daniel Brooks suddenly became aware of every phone pointed at him. Just minutes earlier, the cameras had felt harmless, almost satisfying, like witnesses confirming he was in control. Now they felt dangerous. The people inside the supermarket were no longer watching an elderly black woman accused of stealing groceries. They were watching a police officer slowly realize he had made a catastrophic mistake. The fluorescent lights overhead cast pale reflections across the polished floor while silence settled over the store like heavy fog before a storm. Assistant Director Robert Sinclair stood beside Margaret Hayes with visible restraint, his jaw tight, as though he was holding back words he truly wanted to say. Margaret herself remained composed, almost impossibly calm considering everything that had happened. She adjusted the sleeve of her gray coat and glanced down at the scattered contents of her purse still spread across the floor tiles. Prescription medicine, reading glasses, wheat bread, a photograph from another lifetime. Small ordinary objects that somehow felt sacred now that people understood who she really was. One young employee hurried forward nervously. Ma'am, let me help you with your things, she whispered. Margaret offered her a gentle smile. Thank you, sweetheart. Her voice carried warmth even now. That warmth made several people lower their eyes in shame. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Nobody had stepped in when Brooks humiliated her. Nobody had questioned him when he raised his voice. They had simply watched. Sinclair slowly crouched and picked up the old photograph from the floor. He studied it carefully before handing it back to Margaret with surprising tenderness. Still carrying him with you? He asked quietly. Margaret looked down at the picture of her late husband and nodded once. Every day. For a moment, the tension inside the store softened into something almost human. Then Brooks ruined it. Look, he said sharply, forcing confidence back into his tone. I followed standard procedure based on suspicious behavior. Several people immediately reacted with disbelief. Even the cashier stared at him openly now. Sinclair turned slowly toward the officer. Suspicious behavior, he repeated. Brooks nodded quickly. She bypassed the scanner. The cashier swallowed hard again before finally finding her courage. That is not exactly true, she admitted. The register froze while she was paying. I told him that earlier. Brooks shot her a furious look, but the damage had already been done. Sinclair folded his arms. So let me understand this correctly, he said calmly. You publicly accused a 68-year-old woman of theft before confirming whether the machine malfunctioned? Brooks opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately. Margaret watched him carefully. Not with hatred, not even with anger. That was what unsettled him most. She looked at him with disappointment, the kind reserved for someone who had failed a basic test of character. You assumed, she said softly. Brooks rubbed the back of his neck. Ma'am, with all due respect, people in my job have to make quick judgments. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, she replied. And those judgments reveal far more about the officer than the suspect. The sentence landed heavily inside the silent store. A teenager recording near the frozen food aisle lowered his phone slightly, his expression changing from curiosity to reflection. An older woman near the bakery wiped at her eyes. Because suddenly this situation no longer felt like one misunderstanding inside a grocery store. It felt bigger, older, like a story America had been repeating for generations. Sinclair exhaled quietly and glanced toward the automatic doors where additional federal agents now stood outside near the SUVs. Margaret trained half the agents in my division, he said without taking his eyes off Brooks. Do you know what she taught them on their first day? Brooks said nothing. Sinclair answered anyway. She taught them that authority without restraint becomes arrogance. And arrogance destroys good people faster than corruption ever will. Brooks looked around the store again, finally understanding the full weight of what had happened. The crowd was no longer afraid of him. And for the first time in a very long time, neither was he. The silence inside the supermarket no longer felt accidental. It felt earned. Every person standing near the self-checkout lanes could sense something deeper unfolding beneath the surface of the confrontation. The bright fluorescent lights reflected against the polished floor while the cold air from the freezer aisles drifted softly through the building. Yet nobody moved toward the exits anymore. They stayed because they understood they were witnessing more than an argument between a police officer and an elderly customer. They were watching power shift in real time. Margaret Hayes slowly knelt beside her spilled belongings and carefully placed the old photograph back into her purse. Her movements were unhurried, graceful even now. Assistant Director Robert Sinclair stepped forward immediately to help her, but she gave a faint smile and shook her head. I can manage, she said softly. That quiet dignity hit harder than anger ever could. Officer Daniel Brooks stood frozen near Register 6, his face flushed beneath the harsh white lighting. He kept glancing toward the federal agents near the entrance, as if searching for some sign that this situation could still be controlled. But control had already slipped away from him the moment people stopped seeing Margaret as a suspect and started seeing her as human. A store manager hurried nervously from the back office, holding printed transaction receipts in trembling hands. Sir, he said carefully to Brooks, we checked the register logs. Nobody spoke. The entire front section of the supermarket seemed to hold its breath at once. Register 4 malfunctioned at exactly 6:14 p.m., the manager continued. The payment froze before processing, but the items were never stolen. Brooks stared at him blankly. There was no theft. The manager swallowed hard. No, sir. The words echoed through the store with devastating simplicity. No theft. Just assumption. Just humiliation. Just another person judged guilty before facts ever mattered. Margaret finally rose to her feet again, standing straighter now than she had at any point since the confrontation began. Her calm presence seemed to fill the room in a way nobody could explain. Sinclair looked toward Brooks with controlled disappointment. You escalated a public accusation without verifying evidence, he said. Do you understand how serious that is? Brooks rubbed his jaw nervously. I was responding to suspicious circumstances. Margaret looked at him quietly. Suspicion becomes dangerous when it only points in one direction, she said. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. Several shoppers lowered their eyes immediately because they understood exactly what she meant. Brooks opened his mouth to defend himself again, but this time even he sounded uncertain. I did not mean. He stopped halfway through the sentence because the truth had become impossible to escape. Intent no longer mattered. Everyone inside the store had watched how quickly he assumed the worst about an elderly black woman carrying bread and medicine. They had watched his tone change, his posture change, his patience disappear, and now they were watching him realize that every decision he made had revealed something ugly about himself. Margaret reached slowly into her purse once more and pulled out a folded navy blue handkerchief. She bent carefully and wiped a small streak of spilled milk from the floor tiles near her shoes. Several people looked stunned, watching her clean up quietly after everything that had happened. Sinclair shook his head softly. Margaret, he said under his breath, you do not need to do that. She glanced up at him gently. Respect for a place should not depend on how people treat you inside it. The cashier near the registers suddenly burst into tears. I should have spoken up sooner, she whispered shakily. Margaret walked toward her with slow measured steps and rested a comforting hand against the young woman's shoulder. Fear makes people silent, she said kindly. But silence also teaches others what they can get away with. Brooks looked down at the floor as those words settled over him heavier than any punishment could. because deep down, he knew she was not only talking to the cashier. She was talking to everyone, including him. Officer Daniel Brooks had spent nearly 12 years wearing a badge, and in all that time, he had learned how to control a room with his voice alone. One sharp command usually made people step back. One hard stare usually ended arguments before they began. But standing there inside the cold, fluorescent glow of the supermarket, surrounded by silent shoppers and federal agents, he felt something unfamiliar creeping beneath his skin. Powerlessness. The realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Margaret Hayes stood near the checkout counter calmly, placing her belongings back into her weathered leather purse, while the crowd watched her with a respect that had not existed 20 minutes earlier. The shift was impossible to ignore. Before, people saw an old black woman accused of theft. Now they saw a woman who had served her country longer than many of them had been alive. The contrast hung heavily in the air. Assistant Director Robert Sinclair glanced toward one of the agents near the entrance. "Has local command been notified?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir," the younger agent replied. "Internal Affairs is already reviewing the body camera footage." Brooks felt his stomach tighten instantly. Until that moment, part of him still believed this could quietly disappear. A misunderstanding, bad judgment, maybe an apology and paperwork. But body camera footage meant every word had been recorded. Every assumption, every interruption, every moment where he ignored facts because his mind had already decided who Margaret Hayes was the second he saw her. Brooks cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said stiffly, "if there was a misunderstanding, then I am willing to resolve this professionally." Margaret looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Professionally," she repeated softly. "You stopped being professional when you stopped seeing me as a person." Several people lowered their heads again. The words carried no anger, which somehow made them hurt even more. Brooks shifted uncomfortably while Sinclair watched him with steady eyes. "Do you know what the hardest part of this job was for her?" Sinclair asked quietly, nodding toward Margaret. Brooks said nothing. It was not undercover work. It was not threats. It was not danger, Sinclair continued. It was serving a country that often questioned her humanity before it respected her service. Margaret gave a faint, tired smile, almost as if she had heard that truth too many times before. A young mother standing nearby looked at Margaret with tears gathering in her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered suddenly. Margaret turned toward her gently. "For what?" The woman hesitated. "For standing there and doing nothing." The old agent studied her carefully before giving a slow nod. "Most people believe injustice is only committed by the loudest person in the room," she said quietly. "But sometimes it survives because good people decide silence feels safer." The sentence settled deeply into the crowd. A teenage boy near the soda coolers slowly lowered his phone, shame spreading across his face. An elderly man removed his veteran's cap again and held it against his chest. Even the store manager looked unable to meet Margaret's eyes for very long. Outside the large front windows, rain had begun falling softly across the parking lot, blurring the red and blue reflections from police vehicles parked near the curb. The sound of distant thunder rolled faintly across the evening sky, while the automatic doors opened once more. This time a middle-aged black woman wearing a Navy Internal Affairs jacket stepped into the supermarket carrying a slim folder beneath one arm. Her expression was calm, but unreadable. The moment Officer Brooks saw the badge clipped to her belt, the color drained slightly from his face. She walked directly toward the group without hesitation. "Officer Daniel Brooks?" she asked evenly. "Yes, ma'am." She opened the folder slowly. "Effective. Immediately, your conduct during tonight's incident is under formal review pending investigation." The words landed with quiet finality. Brooks looked around instinctively, almost searching for someone to defend him. Nobody did. Margaret Hayes simply watched him with the same calm eye she had carried from the beginning, and somehow that calmness became the loudest judgment in the entire room. Rain tapped softly against the supermarket windows while Officer Daniel Brooks stood motionless beneath the fluorescent lights, listening to the Internal Affairs investigator explain the next steps of the review process. Every sentence felt colder than the last. Around him, shoppers who once avoided eye contact were now openly staring, some with disappointment, others with anger. But the expression Brooks noticed most was recognition. People were beginning to recognize the pattern, the assumptions, the tone. The quiet way dignity could be stripped from someone before facts ever entered the conversation. Margaret Hayes remained near the checkout lane, holding her purse carefully against her coat, while Assistant Director Robert Sinclair stood beside her like a protective shadow. Yet despite everything that had happened, Margaret herself looked strangely untouched by bitterness. Tired, yes, but not broken. Sinclair glanced toward the internal affairs investigator. "The footage speaks for itself," he said calmly. The investigator nodded once. "We will review everything thoroughly." Brooks finally found his voice again. "I made a judgment call based on the information I had at the time." Margaret looked toward him slowly. "No," she said quietly. "You made a judgment before you had information." The distinction cut deeper than Brooks expected. He opened his mouth to defend himself again, but stopped. Because somewhere beneath his embarrassment and frustration, another feeling had started growing. Shame. Real shame. Not because federal agents were present. Not because cameras were recording. But because for the first time all evening, he was beginning to see the situation through someone else's eyes. Margaret turned toward the young cashier, who had remained frozen near register. "For this entire time. What is your name, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "Emily," the cashier replied softly. Margaret smiled faintly. "Emily, do not spend your whole life being afraid to speak when something feels wrong." The young woman's eyes filled with tears again. "I was scared." Margaret nodded with understanding. "I know." Those two simple words carried decades of experience inside them. Fear. Silence. Endurance. The invisible weight many people carried every day just to avoid becoming the next public misunderstanding. Sinclair stepped closer to Margaret carefully. "The director wants to know if you wish to file a formal complaint." Several people in the store immediately looked toward her, waiting for the answer. Brooks himself slowly raised his eyes as tension tightened across his face. Margaret remained quiet for several seconds before speaking. "A complaint will not change what already lives inside a person," she said softly. Brooks looked down again. The investigator studying him seemed almost surprised by Margaret's restraint. "Even after everything tonight?" she asked. Margaret gave a tired smile. "Young lady, I spent 32 years studying people under pressure. Most reveal who they truly are when they believe they have power over someone weaker." The room fell silent again. Somewhere near the bakery section, a coffee machine hissed softly before shutting off. Outside, thunder rolled farther away now, while rainwater streaked down the dark windows. Margaret slowly looked around the supermarket, taking in the faces surrounding her. Some embarrassed, some emotional, some deeply reflective. "The tragedy is not that this happened to me," she continued quietly. "The tragedy is how normal it felt to everyone watching. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because deep down, they knew she was right." Brooks rubbed his hands together nervously, his confidence completely gone now. "I never wanted to hurt anybody," he said finally. Margaret studied him with calm eyes. "Intent matters," she replied. "But impact matters too." Sinclair glanced toward Brooks carefully. "Do you understand why this became bigger than one mistake?" Brooks swallowed hard before answering. "Yes, sir." But his voice lacked certainty. Because understanding consequences was easy. Understanding prejudice was harder. Margaret could see that conflict happening behind his eyes already. Years of assumptions colliding with one humiliating moment of truth. She slowly reached into her purse and removed the old silver FBI credential again. The overhead lights reflected softly across its scratched surface while she stared at it quietly. "This badge opened many doors for me," she said. "But before I earned it, people only saw a black woman they thought they understood." Then she looked directly at Brooks one final time. "And some still do." The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle by the time the tension inside the supermarket finally began to settle into something heavier than shock. Reflection. The kind that lingers long after voices fade and crowds disappear. Most of the shoppers still remained near the checkout lanes, not because they needed groceries anymore, but because nobody wanted to leave before understanding how this moment would end. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the front entrance with his shoulders rigid, his police radio silent against his chest, while the internal affairs investigator quietly reviewed notes inside her folder. The authority he once carried so comfortably now seemed to hang awkwardly around him like a uniform that no longer fit. Margaret Hayes gently zipped her old leather purse closed and rested both hands on the handle of her shopping cart. Bread, milk, medicine. Such ordinary things. Yet the evening had transformed those simple items into evidence of something much larger than a broken self-checkout machine. Assistant Director Robert Sinclair watched Margaret carefully. "The driver is ready whenever you are," he said softly. Margaret nodded, but she did not move toward the exit yet. Instead, her eyes wandered slowly across the store, studying the faces around her one final time. The young cashier who blamed herself. The mother holding her child close. The teenager who had stopped recording hours ago and now looked deeply uncomfortable with what he had witnessed. Even the elderly veteran near the frozen foods stood silently with tears in his eyes. Margaret had seen those expressions before. She had seen them in courtrooms, police stations, airports, government offices, and neighborhoods all across America during her 32 years with the FBI. People always looked shaken when prejudice became visible enough that nobody could deny it anymore. Because once it becomes visible, everyone must decide what kind of person they want to be afterward. Officer Brooks finally stepped forward. "Agent Hayes," he said quietly. Margaret turned toward him. For the first time that night, there was no aggression left in his voice. No pride. No defensiveness. Only exhaustion. "I owe you an apology." The store fell silent again. Margaret studied him carefully without speaking. Brooks swallowed hard before continuing. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. And I was wrong." Margaret listened calmly, her expression unreadable beneath the cold fluorescent lights. "Do you know what concerns me most?" she asked softly. Brooks lowered his eyes. "That I embarrassed you." Margaret shook her head gently. "No. What concerns me most is how easy it was for you." The words struck him harder than anger ever could. Because deep inside, he understood exactly what she meant. None of this had felt unusual to him in the moment. That was the problem. The assumptions had come naturally, instantly, without resistance. Sinclair glanced toward Brooks carefully, almost measuring whether the lesson was truly reaching him now. Margaret slowly stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "You saw an elderly black woman, and your mind filled the rest of the story in for you," she said quietly. Brooks looked ashamed now, truly ashamed. "I know," he admitted. Margaret nodded once. "Then maybe tonight was not the worst thing that could have happened to you." Several people looked confused hearing her say that. But Sinclair understood immediately. Sometimes humiliation was the first crack that allowed truth to finally enter a person. Margaret reached into her purse one last time and removed the faded photograph of her late husband. She looked down at it with a soft, bittersweet smile. "My husband used to tell me something before every difficult case," she said quietly. "He said the measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes. It is whether the truth changes them afterward." Brooks stared at her silently while rainwater slid down the windows behind him in slow silver streaks. The automatic doors opened briefly as cool night air drifted into the store, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the wet highway beyond the parking lot. Margaret carefully placed the photograph back into her purse and finally turned toward the exit beside Sinclair. But before leaving, she paused near the doors and looked back one final time at the officer standing alone beneath the harsh white lights. "A badge does not make someone honorable," she said softly. "It only reveals who they were before they ever wore it." Then she walked out into the rainy night, while the entire supermarket remained frozen in silence behind her.